Welcome to this presentation, GTO Wizard. I'm your host, Sergio. And today we're going to talk about, as the title suggests, not missing value on the river. So we're going to talk about bet sizings, different lines, slow playing, all that good stuff. So why should I care? In this case, why should you care? Well, it's not just that you should care about it, is that it's one of the things that you should care about the most. Okay, this is, value has on the river maybe 80-90% equity, and value tends to over realize its equity, so you're entitled to, in some cases, more than what's in the pot. So seems intuitive that maximizing that is pretty high priority, and this is something that a lot of people do wrong. So in poker, the vast majority of the money is made with our strong value hands, and everything else is there to either mix up our strategy or minimize loss. So there are some cases where bluffs make a lot of money, but those are more of an exception, and that's outside the scope of this presentation. What we're going to talk about is the fact that, again, most of the money is made with the value, and everything else, the bluffs are there usually to balance out our value so that we end up getting called sometimes, because otherwise we wouldn't ever get called. And then, medium strength hands do make some money, but they generally under realize their equity, especially when they face aggression. Our entire river strategy revolves around how we want to play our value. This is what some people call the cornerstones of a range. Generally speaking, how you want to play your value is going to affect how you want to play other hands in your range. Because if you have a bluff, you don't want to play it in a way that it's not synchronized with your value. Because, you could want to do it in real life, but in theory, that's not how you're supposed to play. And with medium strength hands, you don't want to have a range that's so capped that it realizes almost 0% of its equity. Because if you have a range of medium strength hands that's not synchronized with the value in some way, you will end up just getting raised a lot, facing a lot of aggression, and never getting to showdown. Understanding the incentives that affect our decisions with value will in turn help us maximize our EV with the most important hands. And we will also be able to understand how ranges and strategies work as a whole. So just restating what I just said, there are some variables that affect how we want to play our value, and that comes down to EV. And in the case of GTO, that comes down also to trying to not be too exploitable versus the other player. And that kind of like trickles down to other hands. So let's do a fun poll. What affects river sizing in theory? Okay, so we're not talking about like if you're facing a fish, what things you could think about to extract more value. No, I'm talking like strictly in GTO, in theory, in optimal theory, what affects river sizing in theory. So our opponent's calling frequency, the amount of zero showdown value air in our opponent's range, the amount of hands in our opponent's range that can call a certain sizing, the amount of hands in our opponent's range that beat our value, or our opponent's raising frequency. And some of these are true, some of these are not so true. Okay, I see something clearly beating the rest so far. Okay, interesting. Bit of a mixed. So let me explain what I mean by some of these, because some are pretty clear, like our opponent's calling frequency is just what it is. But maybe, for example, the amount of zero showdown value air in our opponent's range, this means hands that are so bad that they lose even against our bluffs. Okay, the amount of hands that in our opponent's range that can call a certain sizing, this would be kind of like the notion of my opponent has a bunch of third pairs or second pairs, and I have a straight, so I'm going to bet half pot because that's the sizing that my opponent can call. So just a heads up, some of these are bullshit. Okay, some of these are completely wrong. Okay, so I think most of the votes are done already. Let me pull it up over here. So the one that has had the most votes is the amount of hands in our opponent's range that can call a certain sizing. So this last notion I talked about, where our opponent has third pair, you want to bet half pot to get called, followed by the amount of hands in our opponent's range that beat our value. That means just like if you have a top pair, you want to be careful as to not bet so big that you end up just running into the nuts over and over again. Our opponent's calling frequency is pretty much self-explanatory. A little bit of showdown value, zero showdown value air, and then our opponent's raising frequency that's in there. Okay, Pretty interesting results. Let's finish that. So let's talk about that. Folding frequency, okay, which is obviously the inverse of the calling frequency. How much villain folds, which is tied to how much air he has in his range. Okay, so those two first options were relatively similar. They were pretty much the same thing. How much your opponent folds versus a certain sizing is going to have to do with how much air he has in his range. That doesn't even beat our bluffs. So comparatively to our air, does not affect our sizing. Okay, since in theory, he will always find a proportional defense versus every sizing. This means that an optimal opponent, it doesn't matter if his range is only second, third pairs, and you bet at gazillion times the pot, that opponent will find, in theory. So this is a sim where we open the button, get called by the big blind, queen, 6, 7, two-tone. Let me draw one more. It shouldn't be there. So we see bet small flop, get called, jack of spades, so 3 flush, goes check, check. The reason I took this example and this line is because I'm trying to generate a spot where we're capped, where our range lacks, for the most part, very strong hands. We will have some flushes, but not a lot. So I'm purposefully generating a spot where we're mostly going to have medium strength hands. So we check back here. And then let's look at our opponent's strategy. Or in this case, let's say we are this player, the big blind. Okay. We see that some of the sizings used are, 2.5, which is small, 5.5, and then 12, and also 27 big blinds. 27 big blinds is 3 times the pot, roughly, I think, right? So why would the out of position player use an 130% roughly overbet and a 3 times the pot overbet? If I'd never have a hand that can call, let's see what happens when he goes 3x spot. So the in position player is defending some hands, and it's not just flushes. As you can see, we have a tiny amount of flushes over here, but the hands that defend are mostly, well, it has queen jack, but it's defending like king jack at some frequency, right? Queen 9 at some frequency, a6. So one pair hands are defending at some frequency. So it basically, your opponent is always going to find, in theory, some proportional amount of hands to call each sizing, as to not make you able to bluff all of your hands for one specific sizing. If your opponent was inelastic in the ways we're talking about in this example, then we could just put all our bluffs in the sizing that gets the most relative folds to that sizing, and just print and just play value in a different way. Okay, so let's go back. So he will always find a proportional defense versus every size. Okay, so how much he folds doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to go bigger because he folds a lot, or that we're going to bluff smaller because he folds a lot versus small sizings. That's not necessarily true, because again, he will keep folding proportionally to the bigger bets, even if he folds a load versus the small sizing. So example, if his range is composed only of third pair, he will still find a proportional amount of calls versus a 2000% the pot bet. Okay, nice colors. Can you post the hex codes in Discord when you get a chance? Yeah, it's one of the default options in the settings. I don't remember which one. So let's look at some of the theory over here. This is the MDF formula with bluff catchers or better. This means that in theory, there's a certain percentage of the time that you're supposed to defend versus a bet with your bluff catchers or better. So not counting the complete air in your range. So MDF is going to be 1 divided by sizing plus 1. Okay, so example. You don't need to remember this math or like fully grasp the notation. Is more about like understanding the concept behind it. So the example is villain's range. I made it a little bit funky and complex to not make it so boring, but villain's range is 50% bluff catchers and 50% complete air. How much does he defend versus a half pot bet and a 300% Okay, so in this example, I just do the math, and it becomes, it says that versus a half pot bet with this range that only has 50% of bluff catchers and the rest is complete air, then you are supposed to defend half of what MDF is, because only half of your range is bluff catchers or better. It comes out that it's 33%. Okay, so versus a half pot bet, this player is supposed to defend 33% of the time. Versus 300% bet, he's supposed to defend 12.5% of the time. So it's not zero. No matter how big you go, this number will come out as positive. There's no sizing you can choose that will return zero for MDF. Even if you bet 1,000,000,000 trillion times the pot, by the way, this sizing is in times of pot, the MDF is always going to output a positive number. If you have the exclusive nuts versus this range, betting half pot yields 1.17. I calculated this as well. So betting half pot yields 1.17 EV times the pot, while betting 3 times the pot yields 1.38 EV. Okay, and betting with a bluff is indifferent to either sizing. So a bluff kind of like doesn't care what sizing you choose, but value, and we're going to talk about it just now, prefers going bigger even against a range that quote unquote doesn't have strong enough hands to call a 300% pot bet. And the reality is that a lot of the time you might think like, oh, he has second pair, he's never going to call a 300. You don't know. Some people will just call. So all else being equal, bigger is better. In a nuts air versus bluff catcher scenario, the EV of betting different sizings with the nuts is pot plus MDF time sizing. So let me explain this a little bit. So if we're in this spot where we can have either the nuts or air, and our opponent has only bluff catchers, or let's say it could be bluff catchers / air, like in the previous example, but a capped range essentially. The EV of the nuts can be calculated by adding the pot, which is, we always win the pot, plus how often we get called, that's MDF, times how much extra money we make by getting called. So extra money times often we get called, and plus the pot. So that comes out that 50% sizing is 1.33 EV, 100% sizing is 1.5, 200% sizing is 1.67, and so on. So the bigger you bet with the exclusive nuts in this example, the more money you make. And now you might think, okay, that's very cute, but in my games, if I bet too big, they just always fall. They just always fall. This is just a theoretical thing. This is just a theoretical thing that happens in your GTO solver, but not in real life. The reality is that that's not the case. So I run a hand-to-note report over tens of millions of hands of regular mid-stakes players, so excluding recreationals. And the report came out as this. So they fold. They're overfolding. This is all river spots, so there's no line filter, or just every river spot, how much regs are folding. And as you can see, maybe you're not familiar with the general MDF numbers, but I'm telling you right now that all of these are fairly overfolded. So regular players are overfolding river. And we see that this fold versus 2 to 4 times the pot is not 100%. They're not folding 100%. They're calling 17% of the time, or raising. That might seem like they're not calling at all, but the reality is that it's generally better to trade off how often you get called for the reward you get by getting called. Okay, generally speaking, getting called less often but making more money when you do get called is preferred mathematically. Okay, and I calculated this over here. So the EV of betting the exclusive nuts in this particular scenario is going to be for 30% pot, 1.15, 1.21. So as you can see, it does increase. It is lower than in theory. All of these EVs are lower than in theory because your opponents are overfolding. So against passive players that don't put aggression onto you, making money with value is harder, right? But you can see that it does increase versus these population stats. The EV increases with sizing. Okay, so that does hold. By the river, a lot of times we don't have 200, 300% left to bet if 100 big ones. So on, which might be, well, let me give you an example, a very easy example. If you open the button and you get called by the big blind, you're going to be in a spot where the pot is, let's say, 5.5 to 6, or maybe 5 to 6 big blinds. You have like almost 100 behind. If you bet small on flop and you bet big on turn, you're generally still going to have around 2.5 to 300% pot behind. Okay, and this is why, in theory, a very, I wouldn't say a very common line, but a fairly standard line is just bet flop, over bet turn, jam river for 2, 3, 4 times the pot. Okay, and the reason is this: when you have the exclusive nuts, that's generally the preferred line. So we talked about all of the things that are not affecting, all of the things that we responded in the poll that don't affect our sizing is what we've been talking about. Now let's go to the ones that do. So let's talk a little bit about equity distribution. Okay, by betting, we're narrowing villain's range towards his strongest hands, obviously, right? The more he falls from his weaker portion of his range, the higher equity his calling range is going to be. So with thin value hands, we need to make sure that we win the majority of the time after getting called. Therefore, what percentage of his range beat our hand is critical for choosing sizing. Okay, so that was one of the answers that was correct. When we have here I say thin value hand, but in reality, it could be just any hand that's not necessarily very nutted. You want to be careful to not bet so big that your opponent keeps narrowing and narrowing and narrowing his range to the point that you start not winning the majority of the time when you get called. Okay, that's not good. And on the flip side, let's talk a little bit about the nutted hands. Should we also 4x pot with not exclusive nuts? Well, we will talk about it. When I say exclusive nuts, that's a very specific type of hand. That's like the absolute best hand possible that your opponent cannot ever have. Okay, that's a very specific type of hand. But there are other hands that are very strong as well. It's specifically in some lines that are not the nuts. And it could even be that they're not exclusive, but you also want to go very, very big. Yes, that could be the case. So if our opponent has a lot of hands that beat some of our value, he will have a high raising frequency, both with value and bluffs. Okay, this is kind of intuitive. If we bet for a sizing that your opponent in GTO knows that he has in his range a lot of hands that beat the line we took, or that have high equity against the line we took, he will have a lot of raises for value, and in turn he will add a bunch of bluffs to balance that out. So we will end up getting raised a lot. Okay, so if our opponent has a lot of hands that beat some of our value, we're going to get raised a lot, especially against smaller sizings. Okay, and when we talk about like folding frequency being proportional, so it's always going to be the case that you're going to get called some of the time and so on, like that thing we talked about. With raises, it's not so simple. You do get raised disproportionately more the smaller you bet. Okay, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about a little bit. So there comes another one of the answers that not many people got right, but it does affect our sizing. So how often you get raised is going to incentivize you to slow play your hands more into smaller sizings, your very strong hands, or not. So this increases the EV of under-repping or very strong hands by betting smaller. And so this is just what I said. So under-repping, slow playing, taking a line, if you're out of position, it could be checking out of position. So under-repping your hand, you're basically pretending you have a weaker hand so that your opponent puts aggression on you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that, under-repping. So with a hand that deserves winning a big pot, betting smaller to get more calls is not theoretically sound. Okay, if you have a very, very, very strong hand, betting smaller to get called more is not how it works. It doesn't mean that betting smaller is necessarily bad. It's just you don't do it to get called more. Okay, if anything, getting called more is maybe a little bit of a bonus, but that is not the main reason. Betting smaller to induce raises by representing a thinner value hand containing a range is sound. Okay, so we're betting to induce raises by representing a thinner value hand containing a range. So basically, we need to change our frame from I'm betting to get called more often, betting smaller to get called more often, to, okay, I'm gonna try to bet small here and be tricky. So this guy is gonna raise this type of value and this type of bluff. Okay, that's really the frame that you should be working with. So for our hand to be a good candidate for under repping, it needs to gain EV from getting raised. Okay, this is very important, which means we need to have at least 50% equity versus the raising range. This requires it beating a good portion of the value raises. Okay, so let's kind of like reframe some of the common misconceptions around this as well. So inducing cannot be just, oh, I have a bluff catcher and I think this guy bluffs too much. That generally is not inducing, because even though your opponent bluffs too much, for your hand to be a favorite against that range, he would have to be massively over bluffed. Okay, so generally to properly induce, you need to both beat all of the bluffs and then a decent amount of value, to the point that whenever you get raised or whenever you face that bet, you're happy about it. Okay, it needs to be so extreme that you're happy about it. You gain EV, because as we said before, all else being equal, the EV of betting bigger is higher. Okay, so betting bigger is higher. Therefore, there needs to be EV that comes from getting raised. And the only way to gain EV from getting raised is by actually being, not just being a plus EV call versus that raise, but being a favorite against that range. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some example scenarios. So we have big net advantage, and we're representing a very polar. So, okay, so the scenario is going to be bottom versus big blind again, single raise spot, the same flop. So queen 7-6 two-tone, small bet on flop, call, turn jack, over bet, call. And we're going to have three different rivers. We're going to have a big net advantage, one of the rivers, and representing a very polar range. Another river is going to be, so that first one is going to be the 10 of diamonds river. The second river is going to be the 2 of diamonds. So we have a moderate net advantage, and our range contains different kinds of value. And then the last river we're going to look at is the 10 of spades, where we don't necessarily have much of a net advantage. Okay, so let's look at so this is great love inducing. Is small bet always preferred here? In which example? Which situation are you referring to by? Okay, well, you can see the main sizing used more than half of the time is all in. Okay, so the pot is 32 big blinds, the bet is 84, so not quite 3 times the pot, but 2.6. I'm not sure, like a pretty big bet. Oh, I mean a flop. Well, I'm not even looking at that. I don't even remember if this flop was. I just chose the small sizing to get into this line and actually get to the river example. I think this flop could be played in multiple different ways, and there are multiple fine ways to play this flop, but that's outside of the scope of this presentation. Yeah, no problem. So we c-bet the flop, queen 7-6, we get called, jack. So the jack is kind of like that brick that makes our range not benefit a lot from betting for protection, let's say. So we polarize, we go over bet, get called, and the 10 comes. And the 10 is interesting because, we have ace king, our opponent doesn't. Our opponent is going to fold king 9 on flop, usually, most of the combos. Our opponent is going to fold a lot of 9-8 on turn. So he basically doesn't have straights for the most part. He's going to raise sets of 7s and sets of 6s on flop. He doesn't have 10s, jacks, queens. So basically, we have a huge net advantage. This means that, so one of the things that having that net advantage means is that we're not going to get raised a lot if we bet small, because our opponent doesn't have that many hands that beat our value, and therefore he's not going to bluff us a lot either. So that ends up turning our strategy into a mostly, so there are some hands that are going thinner, specifically the weaker two pair. But we're not betting over pairs, but the, you know, Jack 6, 7, 6 go smaller, but the majority of the hands go all in. Okay. And we can see the equity here of these hands: 100, 100, 99.5, 99.6 in the sets. So almost the exclusive nuts, almost the exclusive nuts. So why do you think, so in general, very strong hands do mix some sort of smaller sizing or some sort of slow plate line, and in this case it's doing it a very tiny amount. And the reason why it's only a tiny amount, except with queens, queens has a very good, you know, blocker based reason for betting small, which is that if we go all in, the main hand we would be targeting is going to be hands like queen 10, and we block that a lot, right? But with every other strong hand, we're betting most just all in, and the reason is because one of the reasons to bet smaller is to protect that small betting range. Okay, so you could look at it from two perspectives. So you could look at it from the balance perspective. So you're betting smaller with a few of the very strong hands to protect that small bet range, so that when so your opponent cannot just raise anything versus that small bet range. But also you can look at it from the exploitative perspective, where the reason why you're betting a little bit of the small sizing is because even though you're not getting raised a shit ton, it's still a decent amount. Okay, so let's look at the frequency. So we bet 27. This is going to be like our main small sizing. We get raised 11.5% of the time. Okay, let's kind of like remember this number. So that range is composed of queen 10, queen jack, and some bluffs. So 11.5. Right now, we don't have a reference to say if that's a lot or too little, but when we see the rest of the examples, you'll see. But the main idea is that if we look at the range interaction, I mean, it's just insane, right? Like we have a huge advantage in the higher equity brackets of our range, and therefore a lot of our hands can just go all in. So let's go to the two of diamonds. So same line on previous streets, but on river, we're on the two of diamonds. And what we're seeing now is a little bit different. So here we can talk about a few more things, because we see that the main sizing is around, 3/4 pot. But there's still a decent amount of all-ins, okay? Almost 3 times the pot all-ins, okay? Let's look at the range interaction. And we see that we do have another advantage, but it's not as extreme as in the other case. And in this case, we have this, let's look at the equities. So we have this portion over here that also has a big advantage, but these are not so nutted, right? These are not so nutted. So let's look at the equity again. So over here, so hands like, for example, kings, king, queen. If we look at the equity, it's 83.5, 84.7. Those are hands that if you bet way too big, let's say if you went all in with them, you would end up just running too often into a calling range that beats you, okay? So that leads to having a lot of kind of like smaller bets. And so when you take a hand like sevens that has almost 100% equity, I assume, or exactly 100% equity, you start betting small with it. Why? Well, again, we can look at it from two perspectives. So from the GTO perspective, we have a incentive to build a range around thinner value hands. And if we never put strong hands in that range, we're going to end up getting erased so often that we will under-realize our equity a lot in that line. So we start putting some strong hands in that line. From the explorative standpoint, here we're going to get raised a little bit more, okay? Because now our opponent does have some hands that are better than in the previous board. We still have an advantage, but it's not so extreme. He does have a few more hands to raise, okay? And if we look at that, if we go 27 big blinds, we see that we get raised 13.1%. So it's not a load more. Yeah, exactly. If we only bet big with nutty hands, it's not too hard to exploit us. Yes, exactly. So we get raised more, okay? In this scenario, our opponent can raise. In the previous scenario, I think we couldn't get raised by queen 7, queen 6. That would have been too aggro. Jack 7, Jack 6, queen deuce. But in this example, the big blind can raise with those, and therefore we can induce. And now let's look at the one of our hypotheses was that we cannot slow play with just about any hand. Okay, you're going to take any hand and just bet smaller. Okay, and we can see here that, for example, let's see the difference between this 27 sizing and the 19 sizing, because they're two different sizing on the sim. And as we can see, aces goes for both sizings. King, queen goes for both sides. So top pair, second kicker, chooses both. Big overpair aces, both. And then the hands in between, they only go the bigger one. Okay, so ace queen goes only the 27 big blinds, kings 27. And some of that has to do with the blocker effects and whatnot, but also a big, it is of big importance to understand this way of structuring a range in GTO, which is that we're only going to choose smaller sizings, either with hands that need to bet smaller because they would run into strong hands too often otherwise. So a hand like king queen can go 27, but probably if you gave it a million sizings, it would go somewhere in the middle. But basically, king queen is kind of like not strong enough to go bigger than this sizing. Aces is potentially, well, in the case of aces, maybe it's more of a blocker effect, but in the case, for example, of two pairs like queen jack, you see they are mixing that 19 big blind bet, and these don't mix it, and in fact it's lower EV to choose the sizing. Okay, and the reason is if you bet with this for a smaller sizing that you deserve, you don't capitalize on the thing we talked about in the beginning. So all else being equal, the bigger the better. Okay, so going as big as possible for what your specific hand deserves. So the kings deserves 27. That sizing is going to be better, all else being equal. The only reason why a smaller sizing could be better, besides blocker effects, is going to be the fact that we gain EV from getting raised. And in this case, with ace queen, with kings, we do not gain any EV from getting raised by betting smaller. Therefore, we just never take that line. And you see that the hands that start mixing different lines and taking different sizing are stronger hands than that. Okay, so I don't want you to get to the river with just about any value hand and be like, okay, I'm going to just roll my RNG and choose a sizing from all of the sizes I know. No, think about like what your biggest reasonable sizing is, and then think about what incentives do you have to possibly bet some other sizing. And if you don't find any, maybe that's just the sizing you need to use. Yeah, so let's look at, like, if we bet 19, we get raised 14.9% of the time. We get jammed on. Again, aces is sort of for blocker effects, so the aces mixing didn't have so much to do with equity, but clearly we see that king queen doesn't really like getting raised, because if you have zero EV versus a raise, but you invested money to get into that spot, you lost everything that you invested. So you're indifferent now, but you weren't indifferent before. But hands like queen 7, queen 6, these have, pretty decent equity, right? Okay, so let's look at our last of these three examples. Is it also because we don't want them to fold their medium strength hands if we bet too big? No. Okay. So if you're blocking the top of the range so much that, okay, let me, in some ways you're right, in some ways you're wrong. So again, GTO will always find a proportional amount of calls to your bet, regardless of what the sizing is. So if you have the nuts, let's say, if your opponent has medium strength hands, he will find some calls if he needs to, and he won't if he doesn't need to. But it is, without taking into account raises, it is good to sacrifice that calling frequency that we receive by making the pot bigger when we do get called. Okay, that sacrifice is worth it, generally speaking. But if you have such bad blockers to the top of your opponent's range, it could be like if you bet too big, you're basically weighting the range too much to, for example, hands that beat you. That could be the case. Or just not getting called very often because your blockers are very, very strong, like in the case of queens. Okay. So again, kind of like the logic behind this is we have different hand classes that want to bet for different sizings in terms of how big they could possibly go. And then we use the best of the best, or the hands that want to get raised, that want to induce, because they both beat bluff raises and a lot of value raises, and you start mixing those to protect the other lines. Okay, that's like the way GTO structures the range. Let's look at the last example. Would you also recommend to bet only big with nuts on low stakes? I feel like I don't get raised that often. That's a very good point, okay? And I will leave this at your discretion, but I do agree that there are a lot of spots in poker where your opponent should be raising for value hands that are a bit ridiculous in real life, like hands that most people will not find, those thin value raises, and potentially not bluff you enough. And so if they don't raise you enough with bluffs, if they don't raise you enough with thin value, to the point that when you do get raised, now you're screwed, because now you don't have that higher than 50% equity. It would have been better probably to just choose a bigger sizing. And this is especially true versus weaker opponents where they're more inelastic. And even though it looks like you never, ever get called, you do get called sometimes. You don't need to get called that often to make that sizing good, is the main idea. Okay, so let's look at the last example, and then I'll answer some more questions so we can have like a more dedicated portion to questions. So the 10 of spades comes. So it brings the straight, like in the first example, but now it brings a flush, okay? And it's a flush that your opponent is going to have a reasonable amount of the time, because there are two spades on flop. So he's definitely going to defend with every two spade hand on flop. And then on turn, he's going to defend with a lot of pair plus flush draw, maybe an ace high flush draw, maybe a gotcha plus a flush draw type hand, like those types. So he does have a decent amount of flush draws. We do also have a decent amount of flush draws, but the thing is, relatively speaking, we are not at a nut advantage. And we can look at it here. Let me make this bigger. So we can look at it here. We are at this like middle of range, we're crushing him. Okay, we're destroying him at this middle portion of the range, but in the nut portion, we're not really at an advantage. In fact, we are at disadvantage. Okay. The funny thing you can see here is that there are 0% all-ins. Okay, in fact, there are only 1.4% 48 big blind bets. Okay. One point that I want to talk about that I haven't talked about yet is that you could be betting 150% pot, and if your hand deserves going 300, 400 all in, if your hand deserves that, and you're betting 150% pot, you're still fishing for a raise, okay? What you're doing there is you're fishing for a raise versus that overbet. So if you don't think your opponents are going to be raising very aggressively versus overbets, maybe think twice about having just one standard overbet sizing. Oh, yes, this theoretical mid-stakes guy says 300%, 400% pot, but I have my 150% pot. I'm going to use that because I'm not that advanced yet. Well, if you do that, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be putting hands in slow play lines that never face any aggression from your pool. Okay, you're going to be choosing an overbet sizing that doesn't gain maximum EV, and that doesn't get raised, doesn't get face aggression, doesn't induce your opponents to do anything about it. So getting that out of the way, on this scenario, we see that there are 0 hands that go all in. And the reason is, well, let's just click on the 27. And if you remember in the first example, when we bet 27 big blinds, we got raised like 11% of the time. In the second example, we got raised like 13% of the time. In this example, if we bet 3/4 pot roughly, or 80% pot, we're raised 20.4% of the time. Okay, so a vast increase. And the reason is because now our opponent does have a flush. It's a little bit of a flush advantage, in fact, but at least he has a flush equality, let's say. He can raise a bunch of hands when we bet smaller. And now clearly, from an exploitative standpoint, when we get raised this much, if you have the nut flush, why would you go all in? Okay, you can, if you go all in, you get called 27.7% of the time. So why not bet smaller? You will end up all in 20% of the time still, but then you get, as a bonus, a bunch more calls, okay? So main reason to bet smaller is fishing for a raise, and then the bonus reason is, sure, you get more calls along the way. So yeah, we can see that. Yeah, I think that's most of it for the lesson. If you have any questions, we can definitely go over them. So if you have a question, now is the time to ask. Oh, and by the way, I mean, I repeated this point like 30 times already, so you probably can infer it, but there's also a GTO balance reason for never going all in, apart from just gaining more EV. It's also that we have a bunch of hands, like straights, sets, 2 pairs, that want to go this smaller sizing, and if we don't have that many nuts, so we need to put all of them. Basically, we run out of nutted hands by protecting the smaller bet. Okay, so let me answer a few of the previous questions that I didn't. How would you adjust to the opposite? People who overvalue weak hands or go too thin? Well, generally, I mean, that's a hard thing to come across when it comes to races. So there's few people that will race too thin for value and that will get too aggressive with bluffs as well, because remember, you need to be a favorite versus the raising range. So it's not just that they need to be going thin for value. They also need to be bluffing at a certain frequency for you to be a favorite versus the overall range. So that's hard to come across. But the exploit there is very simple. You just use always that sizing. Okay, if there's a sizing that induces your, and I said it's hard to come across, but right now there are some spots that come to my mind that I have applied this, not just for specific players. So for some players, you could abuse this inducing, fishing for a raise. But in some cases, there are some specific lines or specific textures where people will raise too often because maybe they miss some nuance about the spot, or they misunderstand the strength of your own range. So they might bet, raise too thin. Or the more common one is that they bet too thin. So when you're out of position, there are a lot of situations where if you check, your opponent will misread your range as too weak and he will bet too thin for value. And that's a spot where you were checking to induce, because here we were talking about sizings and overall being in position, but out of position, checking is also a way of inducing in that sense. So you can check, have the other guy bet a bit too thin, and then you can raise it. So yes, abusing those lines. Basically, if you are confident that your read is accurate, then you should pretty much always take that line from an exploitative standpoint, at least. How to adjust out of position on the river if you think villain will overbluff and not value bet thin enough? Okay, that's a very good question. That's a very, very good question, because what happens there, it depends on his overall betting frequency. But what could be happening then is that some of your bluff catcher or close to bluff catcher hands. So let's say there are hands that are bluff catchers, which are 0 EV versus that bet. There are hands that are, strong, that let's say are favorites versus a normal betting range. When your opponent adds too many bluffs and not enough value, what he's doing is he's shifting your threshold to so some of those hands in between those, so not quite the bluff catchers, but some of those that weren't quite making it into the induce category now can induce, okay? Because they're bluffing so much, and now you do have a bunch of equity to kind of slow play. And then with the nuts, it would come down to the degree of how his overall frequency shifts. So if he overbluffs, but then he doesn't bet thin enough, like massively, it could be that his betting frequency tanks down because of not lacking value. And now it doesn't make that much sense to induce. But it could be that he had so many more bluffs than he subtracts value, and therefore slow playing and inducing is a lot better. Do you adjust based on HUD stats? I'm a big HUD digger, exploiter of their stats. Yes, I do use HUDs extensively. You need to be very careful, though, when looking at HUD for this kind of lines and insights, because it's very easy to misapply. Like river lines don't happen very often. The sample is going to be low. Those stats are not going to be usually super reliable. So you need to kind of like use your general understanding of that player profile. So if they're very aggro, if they're very passive, that's generally going to affect how to play them on more obscure lines, more than some specific hot stat for that line. Like some people bet river 5% versus someone who, well, yeah, I mean, if someone bets river 5%, that's that's a big issue. But yeah, like if you have you could have reliable sample of something like that, like someone betting 30%, which is generally speaking too low. You would not want to induce them that much. You would be more like, for example, let me give you another example of exploit. So the one we talked about is someone who's over bluffing but not value betting enough. Let's imagine they're not value betting enough and also under bluffing. So their betting frequency just tanks down. And it doesn't make any sense to induce against that player that bets very infrequently. But now it makes a lot of sense to check with your medium strength hands, because what you see in sims when you're out of position especially is that and this ties to what I was talking about before, is that when you have a medium strength hand on the river and you're out of position, if checking doesn't properly induce for you to be a favorite against the betting range, you generally prefer to take the most aggressive line you can for value, which is like betting small, like betting 1/3 or 25% pot, right? But if your opponent bets very infrequently, now those hands that want to do that, now they shift into, okay, now if I check, I do see showdown very often. Now I don't lose as much EV by facing a bet because I don't face it so often. And now those hands would be more, so you would, against a passive player, you kind of build your range in a more straightforward way, like the nuts bet big, worse hands bet smaller, medium hands check, and like just in a very old school way. And versus the more sophisticated opponent, you would have to like mix it up. So yeah, it's been good. It's been awesome, guys. See you on my next presentation.